It's time for the Bible Geek. I am that geek. Robert M. Price, postmodern, deconstruct, super-powered demigod. I am that geek. Robert M. Price, postmodern. I am that geek. Robert M. Price, postmodern, deconstruct, structuralist, Jungian, etc. Super-powered demigod. In the mood for some geekery? I hope so, because this is Robert M. Price, the Bible Geek, coming to try your patience yet again. I thought I'd address something that I'm not even sure if anybody's asked me this, but yeah, you probably would anyway, so let me nip it in the bud. The recent hoopla or hubbub about the business of Jesus being married. I mean, oh man, that again. This book, The Lost Gospel, has come out by Simcha Jacob. Well, I can never say it. That's not trying to ridicule the guy. Just can't get some of these names right. Anyway, he was involved with the Jesus family tomb and all that stuff. The basic premise of this thing, this lost gospel, is a kind of an interpretation of a 6th century manuscript. I think it's Aramaic. Called Joseph and Asenath. Actually, there's several other language versions of this. It's been known for a long time. It's just a particular version of the text that recently came to light in the British Museum, I believe it was. And in it, the patriarch Joseph, from the last few chapters of the book of Genesis, he is about to be betrothed to Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, and this is part of the Pharaoh lionizing Joseph, making him his second in command and all that stuff. So he marries him off to this daughter of the high priest. Well, in it, Joseph is called the Son of God, and he even appears in a glorious epiphany, much like that of the Jesus figure in the book of Revelation. And Asenath is to convert away from Egyptian religion to the Judaism of the patriarch Joseph. And they have 2 kids and so forth. Well, most of this is in the traditional versions we already had, and but with one big difference I'll get to in a second. But what the authors claim is that this was a very thinly veiled allegory, or I don't know what you'd say, a coded version of a story in which Jesus, the Son of God, is betrothed to Mary Magdalene, and they have a couple of kids and all that. Well, this sounds pretty darn good to him because it goes hand in glove with the Jesus family tomb thing, right? The Talpiot tomb where there are ossuaries, bone boxes with various names on them, a number from the family of Jesus in the Gospels, right? Jesus, Joseph, Mariam, Simon, Judas, Joses, Jacob, and so forth. And they say, now, what are the chances of these names, so well known from the Gospels, appearing all together? Yes, they're all common names, but these and no others appearing in a cluster in a particular tomb in Jerusalem. It's pretty much got to be the family of Jesus Christ, right? Well, I dispute that very strongly because the statistical argument betrays itself. Turns out there are other names in there, and I think of Matthias and a couple of other Mariams or something like that, and they say, well, these people must be the children of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Yeah, that's the ticket. No, it doesn't work that way, right? You can't just select part of the sample of names and say this exact cluster of names appears only in the Gospels, so what do you conclude? No, it's not the exact same names, because there are these other ones you're holding off in order to say, okay, now that I can establish now that I can get you to believe that these others represent the family of Jesus, well, then these too must be new family members of Jesus. Oh, come on. So I think that's bunk. Plus, what are they doing in Jerusalem, for Pete's sake, right? Why not Nazareth? Anyhow, I think that's part of what's going on here. Well, back in 1997, before Noah's flood, I did an article where I suggested that Joseph and Asenath is a Christian writing, and that Joseph, the Son of God, is supposed to be Jesus Christ, but Asenath is not any particular historical individual. She represents celibate Christian women, the so-called order of widows and or virgins, people who were betrothed to Christ and therefore to no earthly mate. In fact, that becomes absolutely clear to me when you read that this marriage is one in name only, because Joseph and Asenath are not to have sex or kids. And it just seems very clear to me that's what this is about. The spiritual brides of Christ. I mean, that was going on for some centuries, and it still survives today in the form of nuns, right? They have these wedding rings because they're betrothed to Christ and not to any earthly bridegroom. So it's now, if this version of it does say they have kids, that's a derivative version. I mean, the text is much later, right, than any of the other ones we have, and so it seems to me, forget it. There's just no reason to think that this is another argument for Jesus having been married and winding up with the Merovingian dynasty, I guess. It's at least that kind of nonsense, so I think it's one more media hype distraction. I don't think it has anything to do with serious historical Jesus studies, if there is such a thing. And okay, now on to some exciting questions. Here's one from Jamie in Kentucky. Greetings, Bible Geek. I attended an evangelical sermon discussing the covenant renewal in 2 Kings 23 and the temple removal of Baal and Asherah articles. The idols and stuff. Afterward, I asked a member why pagan god worship among Yahweh's people is so uncommon today compared to antiquity. The response given was that it's exactly the same as worshiping money or sex, followed by the entire gospel according to Paul. I was unsuccessful at bringing the conversation back by explaining that while money is often put before God, we don't attribute supernatural agency to money. So I asked the Bible Geek what sort of cultural shift happened so that a modern Scrooge is more likely to become a workaholic than to ritualistically acknowledge the presence of a supernatural deity to provide money. We have more means to acquire wealth now, but why not just take the easy way out and ask a God? I understand the spiritual parallels the sermon was getting at. What I don't get is the pious refusal to admit any difference at all between what the church calls today's idols and ancient polytheistic worship. Well, Jamie, I do think there is a profound link, and I understand from what I just read that you're not denying that. But it's interesting that some theologians, Walter Wink, Hendrikus Berkhoff, and others have, what's his name, Yoder, John Howard Yoder. These guys have, of course, he was kind of the Bill Cosby of the Mennonites, if you know what I mean. But these guys have said, yeah, the so-called principalities and powers, the fallen angels were mentioned in the New Testament. They are like big money, the statism, organized religion, all of these things that structure human life, though they are not untainted. They are fallen, but they do structure human life, and it's good that they do because it's better than total chaos. It's like living in gangland Chicago. It's not that great having your authorities be gangsters, but even that's better than rioting in the streets, right? So, in a sense, the principalities and powers, the fallen false gods, don't need official divine names. You really are dealing with the idea. It's a kind of a built-in demythologizing that is quite profound, I think. Well, but why not? But that was true even when they had names like Mammon, who was the god of money, and we still do have the almighty dollar, right? But I think the reason people don't, aside from, you know, modern neo-pagans, the reason most people don't have money gods and so forth is simply the monotheism that overtook Western culture in the wake of the success of Christianity. It just doesn't occur to people never even have heard of. And so they figure, well, look, I can just say Christ will make me money. I think I'll join the Full Gospel Businessmen's Association, or the Christian Businessmen's Association. I'll preach the prosperity gospel, and in effect, you can just as easily make Jesus into a cargo cult deity. And that's what's happened. There's no reason to incur the social embarrassment. Can you imagine? You're going to your business meeting, and hey, Bryce, I hear you've become a worshiper of Dagon? What the hell is the matter with you? There's no reason to do that. You can just say, oh, no, Jesus made me the money. You don't want to look like a nut. And so I think that's really all it is. You don't need paganism when you've got money worship under the name of Christianity. I remember once my old pastor Don Morris said, look, if you want to get rich, go ahead and get rich. Just don't do it on the back of the poor man from Nazareth. Okay, next up is Evan. And I think that, yeah, okay. He says, the parenthesis, quote-unquote, seems to be a critical component in dispensationalist theology, but I don't hear much about it. Is it scriptural? Is it plausible? Does it all unravel without it? Well, Evan, I think, of course, what do we mean by the parenthesis business? This is a function of the dispensational theology that says we mustn't spiritualize away God's promises to Israel, all that literal theocracy, the progeny of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob actually being promised real estate in Israel. Because, of course, Catholics and Calvinists and others had a habit of saying these promises really don't apply literally, and least of all to non-Christian Jews. These must be spiritual promises to Christians who are the true Israel. Well, even Protestants said this despite their claim to want to interpret the Bible literally, right, ever since Martin Luther. And, of course, Luther wanted to do that because if you didn't take it literally and read it like you would any other human document, there'd be no controlling what it might be taken to say. You could use allegory and say the Bible's teaching anything I wanted to teach and make the Bible into a ventriloquist dummy. And so in the 19th century, I think it was, maybe it was the early 20th. Geez, I'm getting rusty. John Nelson Darby, who founded the Plymouth Brethren denomination and created dispensationalism, he said, no, let's be consistently literal and say that all the promises to the patriarchs were meant literally. All the prophecies of a Davidic Messiah to restore independence to Judah, those were meant literally, and they're going to happen. Now, that doesn't sound like they were talking about a spiritual redeemer, the Son of God who would die for sins. That's a whole different shooting match. But that's true, too. It was just that this major development in salvation history was not anticipated. It was not made known to ancient Israel or to the prophets. And they didn't know about it. They didn't have to know about it. They lived in different dispensations, that is, periods in which God dealt with his people in a particular way, on certain terms. And he could change those, and he has several times. The innocence of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, which must have lasted about 30 seconds. Then the period of human conscience that went on through Noah. then the period of promise initiated with Abraham, then the period of the law inaugurated by Moses, and then the dispensation of grace. As of the day of Pentecost, Christianity begins. The church belongs to Jews and Gentiles, mainly Gentiles. So they have different promises. And, of course, they overlap because Jews could belong to the church and do, and Gentiles will have a role in the millennial kingdom centered in Jerusalem. So yeah, they're going to coincide and overlap like a helix pattern, but they're different things, different trajectories of God's salvation history. And so the church age, the age of grace, was a parenthesis, hidden, like Paul says in Ephesians. This is the mystery hidden from ages and generations, but now made known to the saints. Who could have guessed this? But it's happened. We're not going to pretend that everybody knew this. In fact, if you read Calvinists or the Book of Mormon, you see the ridiculous implications of believing otherwise. You're going to start saying that the ancient Israelites knew Jesus was a-coming one day and would die for their sins and rise from the dead. Well, they say so, but that's absurd. You can't read any Old Testament text in anything like a straightforward manner and come up with Christian soteriology. So it just forces you to again use the text as a ventriloquist dummy. Well, the parenthesis approach dared to say, yeah, that stuff was about what it appeared to be about. And the church and the crucifixion, the resurrection, behold, I am doing a new thing. If someone were to tell you, you'd gasp in shock, to paraphrase Isaiah. Yeah, that's what it was. God can reveal really new things. And he did. So this parenthesis will be over as of the rapture, and then God's timetable for theocratic Israel resumes, etc. So yeah, it is a fundamental part of the structure of dispensationalism, and I must say it is a respectable attempt to be straightforward and honest with a lot of biblical texts that get eviscerated on most Christian understanding. So yeah, it is very important. It's a kind of progressive revelation doctrine, but one that actually makes some sense, unlike the usual version. So I'm glad you brought that up, Evan, a neglected aspect of theology. Let's see who's our next questioner. Don't tell me I've lost the name. I don't think I have. It's a long... Don, okay. Yeah, let me go back up. From the hallowed Bible Geek. 1. Regarding the word ektroma in 1 Corinthians 15:8, what is going on with translating the word as one untimely born? When I hear last of all... Oh, here it is, yeah. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. It's at the end of the list of resurrection appearances. When I hear the passage, which consists of a long list of appearances of the Christ, followed by this, it makes the passage sound to my Baptist-formed ears as though it is explaining that Paul is the apostle who was called last, perhaps the only one who didn't personally know Jesus. He wasn't one of the 12. No. I don't know the ancient Greek language, but from what I've read, there is no directly temporal meaning to the word ektroma. Instead, the word means abortion. Some people also say that abortion entails all miscarriages as well, so that the class of abortions would contain both those that are caused by an abortifacient and those that occur spontaneously. However, the thing that would be common to all of them is that they occur before pregnancy reaches full term. So any abortion then could rightly be described as an untimely birth. However, if the word ectroma doesn't also contain a secondary definition that conveys only the sense of untimely birth without miscarriage or other intervention, then it seems like the translation of ectroma as one untimely born is defective. It cannot be the case that the passage means to describe Paul's late arriving apostleship, since the valid timeliness aspect implicit in the idea of abortion relates to something happening too early, not something happening too late. If the point of the word ectroma is to highlight the idea of timeliness, it just doesn't work. No one would write, "Last of all, I was called early." Oh, yes, what a good point that is. And is there some apologetic or harmonizing purpose in the common translation of ectroma as one untimely born? What do you think is the author's intended meaning? Is it anything other than pious self-flagellation in comparing oneself to an abortion? Okay, I'm glad you asked that question, because I have thought for some time that this is a reference to the Gnostic demiurge, that these stories are of Gnostic cosmogony, how the world got here, are filled with the origin of the world, the testimony of truth, the hypostasis of the archons, and so forth. These have to do with the misbegotten, defective, mutant virgin conception of the Creator, Yaldabaoth, a.k.a. Yahweh Sabaoth, Jehovah, the Creator God. He says, "I am God, there is none other beside me," provoking laughter from the divine beings above him in the hierarchy, whose existence he doesn't even suspect, dope that he is. He really thinks he is the only God. But in fact, he's a buffoon. He's also called Saklos, the blind one. And he gets the bright idea, sarcastically, of making a material world. Oh, what a mistake. And because of matter, that's why there is sin and lust and death and all of that stuff. So a bungling creator. He is called the abortion, the ectroma. And it seems to me that the point is not that Paul is the abortion, it's that the appearance, the final appearance to Paul is like that of the man of light reconstituted, the man of light, one of the ions, one of the divine beings from the pleroma, the heavenly realm of light. He had been destroyed by the henchmen of the demiurge to steal his photons and use them as self-replicating DNA to get the material creation of the demiurge up and running. But thanks to the Gnostic Redeemer, he's eventually put back together and appears to the demiurge and his creation. It's a kind of a Gnostic version of Christ appearing before the souls in Hades and leading them to salvation, or Enoch appearing before the fallen angels in 1 Peter and so on. So I think it's a reference to the underlying Gnostic cosmogony and redemption myth that have been historicized into the Christian myth of a historic Savior dying and rising and appearing to somebody. So I think it's a case where truth is stranger than fiction. And I guess it's sort of harmonizing, but in all fairness, I think the traditional translation, I would say, like you, mistranslation, is really just a desperate attempt to make some sense of it. It never occurred to any of these translators that it has something to do with Gnosticism, and one can understand why. It's a pretty weird explanation, but I am pretty favorable to it. 2. I've heard you say before that the popular notion of the rapture is not really found in the New Testament. You mentioned 1 Thessalonians 4:17 as being a source for the idea, but not quite carrying the water it is assigned, because it ends with, So shall we always be with the Lord, therefore comfort one another with these words. I believe the argument goes then that it doesn't count as the rapture because there is no reference to this marking the beginning of a tribulation, nor warnings that unpiloted ships and chariots will begin to crash, nor any other signs of the popular conception of the apocalypse. So granted that 1 Thessalonians 4:17 doesn't go as far as we would need to establish the popular view, isn't it fair to say that the passage is generally consistent with Matthew 24:40 through 42, where we read, "Then there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming." This doesn't seem to contradict the Pauline passage and seems to flesh out the idea by acknowledging that there are people left behind with a clear indication that you don't want to be one of those. Not meaning to be an uncritical harmonizer here, but I would say that the two passages aren't in apparent conflict, don't try to say exactly the same thing, and together paint a picture that sounds like the rapture to me. Am I missing something? Yes, you're going to miss the rapture, Don. Just kidding. I think that they are not about the same thing. For one thing, in Thessalonians, it's pretty clear that when Christ comes back, it's the end of the game. The pre-tribulation rapture idea assumes that there are two second comings of Christ. He comes in the clouds with a trumpet blast to beam up all the redeemed, but then it's going to be the tribulation on earth for the next 7 years, and then he's coming back to kick ass, and that is not hinted at in the New Testament. The business of the dead in Christ rising does not allow for them returning to the earth in great glory after 7 years. So shall we ever be with the Lord. In other words, thus, in this manner, we shall always be with the Lord. He comes down to summon us up to heaven, just like in the Gospel of John. I will come and I'll prepare a place for you in my Father's house. Not leave you orphans, but come back and take you so you may be where I am. That's what's going on in the famous so-called rapture passage. It does talk about being caught up for sure, but the idea that you're caught up bodily, I don't think that's very likely if it comes from the same writer as the one that said flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. Right? So you're talking about something rather different. And as for the... it doesn't, in other words, anticipate... a return to the body. Okay, but as for the one where one take and the other left, the passage goes on to the disciples being puzzled, saying, "Where, Lord?" And he says, "Where do you think? Wherever the body is, there the vultures will be circling." Apparently, and what does it say in the same context? Everybody was going along business as usual until the flood intervened and carried them all away, that is, to their doom, right? So the ones taken are going to be taken to their destruction. I don't think that's about the rapture with the righteous being taken, nor does the synoptic apocalypse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, talk about a rapture when it says he will send forth his angels to gather his elect from the east and the west. Surely, in the context of Jewish apocalyptic imagery, that means he is going to bring Jews back to the promised land from the diaspora. Those are the elect. We're too quick to read Christian theology back into that. So I don't think the two passages together do support anything like the traditional fundamentalist view of the rapture, but I am far from saying that the meaning of these passages is completely clear. I just don't think they support the standard rapture doctrine. Okay, thanks, Don. Very good questions. Reuven, this is a goodie here, as they all are. Could Lilith have originally been Enosh's wife, later added as Adam's wife? I think Reuven is presupposing here that as Wellhausen recognized long ago, Enosh is another version of Adam, a counterpart figure in another cycle of ancient Israelite mythology. Enosh just means man, and he must have been the first man in some of the Hebrew myths, whereas Adam, I think, was originally the eponymous divine ancestor of the Edomites, and so he's suggesting, well, maybe that just as Genesis 1, the priestly account, is a different version of the origin of humanity, and in that one, men and women are made at the same time. You don't have one guy, then a bunch of animals, then one gal, right? Well, in the same way, perhaps Lilith originally was the bride of the first man, but Enosh, not Adam, and when they decided to... well, they didn't exactly harmonize Enosh and Adam. They made Enosh a descendant of Adam, right? But once they got him out of the picture, maybe they decided to continue to imagine her as the first wife of the first, as the wife of the first man, but they had to harmonize her with Eve, and they figured, well, how about saying that she was his first wife? And then there was a tiff between them, and she left, and Eve was the replacement. That would be an interesting variation on the rabbinic theory that that Genesis 1 and 2 do fit together, and that Adam would have been one of the men, Eve would have been one of the women, or Lilith would have been, but Eve came along later. Well, this might be why. It's sort of another version of the rabbinic legend theory to harmonize the two. But anything's possible. Another one, he says, I have a question about the term in the Mandean religion, Nasirutha, and its possible connection to Jesus of Nazareth. According to the Mandeans, this word means priestly craft. Is it possible that Jesus of Nazareth, like Mary Magdala, originally referred to a person's trade and not a specific city in the Galilee? Yeah, I think I tend to take it to be a reference to the Nazarene sect, which is, of course, what the Mandeans actually call themselves. They do use the word, the same root word. One of the Gnostic revealers in Mandeanism is Didache, knowledge of the life. So yeah, you can call them Mandeans, but they call themselves Nazarenes. And Epiphanius tells us about a pre-Christian sect called the Nazarenes, and I think that's what Jesus the Nazarene originally denoted, and that the gospel writers either don't understand that or don't like it because they don't want to think of Jesus as having been tutored by somebody else, and so they say, well, no, it must mean he was from Nazareth, because in their day there was a populated Nazareth, but in the time they pictured Jesus living, there hadn't been, as archaeology shows, but they already didn't know that. Why would they keep up with it? But I think it does mean something other than a place name. I believe Guignabert thought it meant something like the Holy One, that it was a title for Jesus, but not a place name. Reuven also says, is it possible that Didache circulated alongside Matthew, hence Justin Martyr's confusion over the gospel being the memoirs, equivalent to teachings, of the apostles, and the connection between the Didache and Acts? It could have. There's some similarities between the two. They both mention the wandering apostles, but the itinerant charismatics, the apostles, are still a going thing in Matthew, whereas they've become a suspicious bunch in the Didache. So the Didache seems to me a bit later. And if you accept the argument of some that the Didache actually quotes Matthew rather than simply sharing common traditions, that would imply, I should think, that the Didache is later. But there's some reason to think they're both to be located in Syria, and so it is possible. It's the memoirs of the apostles. It is the same sort of idea, the Didache, which means the teaching, I think singular, the teaching of the 12 apostles to the nations is the whole name. It does take off on the same motif as the Great Commission in Matthew 28 does. But Matthew itself is a teaching manual for the Gentile converts of the nations. So so it's the same sort of thing as the Didache. I kind of think it probably is not related to it. But again, who knows? We're all speculating here. And, let's see. Here's one from Ryan. It says, the beliefs of the Ebionites seem to be much less elaborate than Orthodox beliefs. They did not believe in a virgin birth. They held Jesus was only the adopted Son of God. They were thoroughly Jewish and believed in a resurrection that was only spiritual. The Ebionite religion, in fact, looks like what you would expect if a primitive version of Christianity had survived into the 2nd century. To what extent, if any, do you think Ebionite Christianity argues for a historical Jesus? After all, the Ebionites held to a primitive Christianity, and their Christianity held that Jesus was a historical figure. It follows that belief in the historicity of Jesus was an early belief, which seems difficult to explain unless he existed. That is a plausible argument. The problem is there's always the possibility that Christianity began in Alexandria among Hellenized Jews and got Judaized by people that liked what they heard but didn't want to depart from Judaism. And in that case, it's a question of it being one of several possible ways of combining the two. One factor that makes that reading a little bit plausible, I should say, is Hans Joachim Scheps' theory in his great little book, Jewish Christianity, subtitled something like Sectarian Disputes in Early Christianity, some such thing. He says that it looks an awful lot like that the Ebionite doctrine of the false pericope, that is, that Jesus' big mission was to point out which passages of the Torah were spurious interpolations, something anticipated much in the same vein in Jeremiah chapters 7 and 8, where it says God never made any commandments about sacrifices back in the days of Moses. No. The lying pen of the scribes has falsified the scripture. Well, that's what Ebionites said, and mainly it was laws of animal sacrifice, and they attributed to Jesus the saying, unless you cease from sacrificing, the wrath of my Father will not cease from you. Well, Scheps said that he thought this was a Jewish Christian reaction to Marcionite claims that given all the gross stuff in the Old Testament, that it couldn't have come from the God of Jesus, the Father, and that therefore the God of Jesus, the Father of Jesus, was not the law-giving creator, the Hebrew God. Well, these guys know more than the Catholics. I should say the Ebionites, no more than the Catholics, were willing to just cut off the Old Testament and divide the Father from Jehovah. So they said, however, unlike the Catholic Church, who just sort of harumphed and went on, the Ebionites said the Marcionites do have a point. There are unbecoming, objectionable aspects to the Torah that we too cannot believe a righteous God stipulated. So it must be that somebody snuck in some stuff, and how would we know unless Jesus came as the revealer? Actually, that's kind of like Gnosticism, right? The epistle of Ptolemaeus, I think, which says, look, let me set you straight here. There are elements in the scriptures, the Old Testament, that do come from God, but there are others that have a purely human origin and others that are demonically inspired, and luckily we Gnostics know which is which. It could be the Ebionites borrowed that from the Gnostics, which would mean they're not quite as primitive in their known form as it sounds like. I would still say that their rejection of the virgin birth implies they saw that as a pagan admixture, syncretism, and that does very likely attest an earlier form of it, stemming from, let's say, a version of the Gospel of Matthew before the virgin birth stories were added, or before they were understood to imply virginal conception. Because, as Jane Shaberg pointed out, there's a good Jewish way of reading Matthew that does not imply a pagan-style miraculous conception. So I think what you're saying is very likely. It's just not an open and shut case as I used to think it was. There's still, even with regard to that, too many iffy factors. One last one. We're also told the Ebionites had a more elaborate Christology than we read in those patristic reports that say that they just believed he was adopted. I mean, yeah, there must have been Ebionites that thought that, but there were those who said, no, Jesus was yet another incarnation of the spirit of Adam, which had also appeared as Moses, Noah, Enoch, etc., very much like the prophetology of the Quran. So what is primitive about the Ebionites, and what represents influence from other groups, Gnostics, Marcionites, who knows? It's just a little too complicated to be sure, though what you say is quite likely and a very viable possibility. Let's see. Well, I guess that's probably enough for today. I hope to be back with you a little more regularly in the near future to do more Bible Geeks. And thank you for your continuing interest in the increasingly scarce podcast. And I'll remind you, we're always having some trouble keeping things together here. Live by a wing and a prayer, and don't even have the prayer available. But if you can help us out, that'd be good. If you can't, don't worry about it, and keep listening to the Bible Geek. See you soon.
In the Bible we are told, in that ancient lore of old.
The Bible Geek was recorded by Robert M. Price and produced by John Felix and Sergeant Jovanovich. Theme song by John Morris. Visit us at robertmprice.mindvendor.com for more info on Robert's projects, purchase Bible Geek merchandise, and click the ever-important Donate button. Send your questions to criticus@aol.com, and be sure to rate and review the Bible Geek on iTunes. Thanks for listening to the Bible Geek. I'm Torrin Anderson.
Placed on the firing line, so you'd better brush the dust from that old Bible and look up to the stars when they shine.